Good evening. My name is Almaz Zalecki, and I'm the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs at the Founding Division of the New School. Thank you for joining us this evening for a conversation on Jewish secularism, hosted by the Posen Foundation in collaboration with the New School's Jewish Cultural Studies program. I'm especially pleased to welcome this evening Felix Posen and his son Daniel Posen. Mr. Posen is the founder and president of the Posen Foundation, and I'm also pleased to welcome his colleagues from the Foundation's Academic Advisory Committee, and the Center for Cultural Judaism. The New School's Jewish Cultural Studies program, led by Professor Carolyn Berman, explores Jewish cultural life with particular focus on the contributions of Jewish thinkers and artists to secular intellectual and cultural traditions. In addition to a dynamic series of courses in the social sciences, humanities, and the arts, the program has also been the sponsor of a very stimulating series of public programs, from honoring the legacy of Jewish scholars at this university to an upcoming program in April that explores the art of the kvetch, Jewish humor as secularism. Many of these public programs have been recorded and can be viewed on the New School's website at newschool.edu/Jewish culture. I encourage you to visit the website and catch up on any programs you may have missed. In addition, please be sure to pick up a Jewish Cultural Studies brochure or a New School bulletin on your way out this evening for more information on the curriculum and course offerings. In the tradition of the New School, all of our courses are open to students on a credit or not-for-credit basis. Jewish intellectual life has deep roots at the New School, and several luminaries have played an important role in the institution's history and contributed a great deal to our scholarly community, from Horace Kallen and Leo Strauss to Hannah Arendt and Max Wertheimer. Through the Jewish Cultural Studies program, we are honored to advance new lines of inquiry and investigation, exploring the legacies of individuals who questioned, engaged, or adopted a secular stance. On behalf of my colleagues at the university, and in particular Executive Dean David Scobie, I'd like to express our gratitude to the visionary philanthropist Felix Posen and the Posen Foundation, whose generous support has helped to make this evening and the Jewish Cultural Studies program possible. Thank you. And now, I am pleased to welcome Robert Siegel, the multiple award-winning senior host of National Public Radio's All Things Considered.
Thank you. Thank you. That's all you need to say about me. I
have just a little bit more. Mr. Siegel has worked in radio news since he was a college freshman in 1964. I think he was at some small university uptown, if I'm remembering correctly. And he has been with NPR since 1976. He's reported on a wide range of topics, from the 1968 demonstrations at his alma mater, Columbia University, to the criminal justice system, from peace movements in Germany to the changing American political landscape. As we all know, it's been a tough week for NPR. But I'm honored to welcome the man behind the smoothly reassuring voice of All Things Considered.
Thank you.
To host this fascinating panel in front of an audience that I'm willing to bet includes more than its fair share of public radio member supporters. Mr. Siegel.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Your applause and your concern are much appreciated. Hi, I'm in from Washington here in my hometown. I grew up a few blocks east of here. And as I came to my hotel today, I turned on WNYC. And Jonathan Schwartz was on the radio. And at that very moment, he was playing the Alan Sherman song, Shake Hands with Your Uncle Max, My Boy, and here's your country. And on the day when I was about to take part in the conversation on Jewish secular thought, it occurred to me that this was an example that the category things that are Jewish is very, very broad one, and covers both quite high ideas and a great deal of shtick as well. I then went down and bought a sandwich that was called a classic Italian sandwich and thought that that too had implications about identity and assimilation and pluralism in America, but it wasn't as funny as the Alan Sherman song. The subject here, one of the facts which we spring off from here is that, as was recently confirmed by the American Jewish Identity Survey, a great many people in America identify themselves as Jews, Jewish, but do not affiliate with a synagogue and do not follow much Jewish ritual. They are secular Jews. Speaking as someone who is affiliated with a synagogue, I'm accustomed to hearing this described as a great dilemma. I'm delighted to take part in an event as someone who reads a great deal of secular Jewish writing and writing by Jews who are secular in a context in which it is not regarded as a deficiency. It's not a vitamin J deficiency, but rather a very powerful current in American Jewish history and American Jewish thought. Having read and prepared a bit for this conversation, I'm left with many questions about Jewish secularism, which, for example, how Jewish is Jewish secularism? Do you have to be born Jewish to be a secular Jew? How does secular Jewish life differ in this country and in Israel, and the two largest Jewish populations? What's different between Jewish secular thought and lapsed Catholic thought? Was Pat Moynihan a secular Jew when he wrote for commentary? I have many questions, and my job here is to put them to our panelists and also to field your questions from the microphones that are here in the auditorium. They are eminently qualified to answer these questions and many more. David Biale, who spoke earlier today, is professor of Jewish history and chair of the history department at University of California, Davis. His new book is Not in the Heavens, the Tradition of Jewish Secular Thought. Welcome.
Thank you.
David Biale. And Rebecca Newberger Goldstein is both a novelist. Her latest novel is 36 Arguments for the Existence of God, a work of fiction. And also a very accomplished philosopher. She was the author in 2006 of the book Betraying Spinoza, the Renegade Jew Who Gave Us Modernity. It was part of the Jewish Encounters series. And welcome to both of you, and it's my honor to be talking with you. I'd like to begin with history, since both of you have written about Spinoza and this original moment for secular thought. Betraying Spinoza is part of a Jewish Encounter series, which raised the question, would he have considered encountering him an encounter with a Jew? Does he belong in there with Emma Lazarus and Rabbi Hillel? What do we make of this moment in history when Spinoza changes the way we think, Rebecca?
So it's two different questions, what Spinoza would have made of all this. He definitely has been appropriated by Jews as a Jewish secularist. So there's that question, what would he have made of that? And strangely, I feel that I know. And then there's the question of, how he has played a role in Jewish secular thought, and was that a distortion of Spinoza's own thought? Spinoza is he's something very, very new in the 17th century. When I said the renegade Jew who gave us modernity, I meant this very seriously. That Spinoza was part of the extraordinary intellectual vitality of the 17th century that gave us modern physics and gave us modern philosophy. And it was a complete rejection of the old Aristotelian teleological way of thinking that had everything all wrapped up and had science wrapped up as well. And Spinoza as an extreme rationalist. He's really, there are the three great rationalists of the 17th century, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz. Spinoza is the most extreme of the rationalists. He is a person who made every claim on behalf of reason that has ever been made. Reason can do it all, including making us better people, including making society better. His magnum opus is called the Ethics. This is all, so this is a new model, part of the rejection of the Aristotelian way. how his Jewishness comes into play is an interesting story, and I speculate about this on an emotional level, how it comes into play. But in terms of his intellectuality, he is really the first secularist. When he was put into cherem by his own community.
Effectively excommunicated, effectively.
The word excommunicate sounds a little harsher and more stern than cherem, because cherem was a form of social control, much used by the Amsterdam community. It was a very fractious community, a very fascinating community, but it was usually temporary. It depended on your transgression, and you did your penance, and you were welcomed back into the community. Spinoza, who was then Baruch Spinoza, after the cherem, he changed his name to Benedictus. They both mean, of course, blessed. He was put into cherem when he was 23 years old, and it is the most violent, fierce condemnation, and there is no penance to be done. He is sent out and
without parole, without possibility of parole.
Never to return. Nobody could talk to him. Cursed be he by day, cursed be he by night, cursed be he when he goes out, cursed be he when he comes in, cursed be he, cursed be he. It just goes over and over. It's very long on curses, very short on what the actual transgression was. And so there's, of course, much speculation about that. He was 23. He certainly hadn't published anything. He didn't seek to re-enter the community, nor did he seek entrance into any other Jewish community as other people had done who had been put into cherem. When the word was brought to him that he had been put into cherem, he said, good. I wouldn't have had the courage to do this on my own, but since they send me out, I go happily. Never tried to make any contact, again, with the Jewish community. His ethics, this first claim as the first truly universalist work, makes the very, very radical claim that to the extent that we're rational, which is what we ought to be, we all share in exactly the same identity. He really spurns these kinds of inherited identities in terms of the people you are born into, the gender, the nationality. He would never identify himself as anything except for a citizen of the Republic of the Netherlands. He was proud of that. So how would he feel about this being embraced and being made such a central character in Jewish secularism? I think he would be quite bemused by the whole thing. Right. Yes.
Well, that's David Biale. You've written about Spinoza as well. You referred to him as the last medieval heretic, the first modern secularist. What's his Jewishness, seriously?
So, I agree with Rebecca that he would be bemused at a minimum, probably more than that. He would probably be hostile to the idea of being called the first secular Jew. It's quite clear that he left and didn't look back. Nevertheless, and here I find the great Harry Wolfson, great historian of philosophy at Harvard, who wrote voluminously about Spinoza, said, we can never understand the mind of Benedictus without understanding what passed through the mind of Baruch. That is, that something in the background there, in the Jewish background, does account for the particular directions that at least Spinoza took. Now, that doesn't mean that it was only Jewish influences. Spinoza, one can't reduce somewhat of Spinoza's greatness to one particular influence or another. And he was deeply read in the philosophy of his own day, as well as that of the Middle Ages. But it seems to me that if you read the Theological Political Treatise, the only major work of Spinoza that was published during his lifetime, the Ethics was published posthumously by his disciples, you find there that there is an ongoing conversation, struggle with aspects of the Jewish tradition. The person whom he quotes with great favor, actually, is the 12th century Jewish philosopher and exegete Abraham Ibn Ezra, whose reading of the Bible Spinoza takes to an extreme far beyond anything that Ibn Ezra himself would have even recognized. But he takes certain ideas in Ibn Ezra and he then builds his own philosophy of, or reading of the Bible on top of that. He quotes the great philosopher Moses Maimonides in order to reject him, Maimonides' allegorization of the Bible. But I believe that his struggle with Maimonides goes deeper than that, and that there are ways in which his own views of God as equivalent to the universe, is a kind of a dialectical playing out of something that starts with Maimonides. For Maimonides, God is totally transcendent. Spinoza turns him on his head. So there is an ongoing dialogue here with certain aspects of the Jewish tradition. The fact that Spinoza's book is first and foremost an attempt to reread the Bible. Now, of course, Spinoza wasn't the only one trying to reread the Bible in the 17th century, and this is when we have the beginning of modern biblical criticism. But I think that his rereading of the Bible is one that is deeply informed by where he first encountered the Bible, namely in the synagogue.
So you're describing someone who, if he was, for shorthand, a Jewish heretic, you would say think as much about Jewish as about heretic. Think about where he's coming from as much as what he develops in secular.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the arguments that's often made about, or has been made by certain historians about 17th century thought, is that these 17th century thinkers take categories from scholasticism, from the Middle Ages. They empty them out of their medieval meaning and they fill them with entirely new meaning that really is the foundation of modern science. And in the same way, Spinoza is engaging with these categories from the Jewish Middle Ages and making them mean something entirely different.
Yeah, could I, I really feel that, or think that Spinoza's notion of God, I think, is so extremely different from Maimonides. Maimonides is really the one who introduces Aristotelianism into philosophy. This is really, Maimonides' project was to try to reconcile the two great truths, and he starts out with the conclusion that the Torah is true and that the best science of his day, which was Aristotelian, is true, and so that there's some way to reconcile them, and that you read the Torah in a way to try to reconcile it with the great science of its day. Spinoza says in the Theological Political Treatise in chapter 7 that this theory of Maimonides, we can dismiss this theory of Maimonides as pernicious, useless, and absurd. That is, that you start only. But much more importantly than his divergence with Maimonides and how you read Torah, how you read the Bible, is the notion of explanation, of a teleological explanation of seeing design in the world. And Spinoza, that's introduced into philosophy by Maimonides. St. Thomas Aquinas was very, very influenced by Maimonides. Aquinas calls Maimonides Rabbi Moises, which is very unusual. He refers to all of his contemporaries as Quidem, that person, that anonymous person. But he has a tremendous, and Aquinas really follows Maimonides in this trying to reconcile, and this is what becomes medieval philosophy. This is the thing that Spinoza, together with Descartes, together with Leibniz, together with Galileo, are rebelling against. It's completely. Spinoza says in the appendix to his first book of the Ethics on God. This doctrine would have sufficed to conceal the truth from the human race for all eternity, had not mathematics provided a new standard of truth by showing the inner necessity of things and expelling final causes, which means design.
Right. So you're saying, see him, he's a Jew in Amsterdam, see him as a European who is part of the intellectual and scientific ferment of the time. He makes a deep break with everything that's going on around him and ignore the Baruch part, ignore the Talmud Torah and all of this Jewish study?
I mean, I think that unfortunately, his letters had been very censored by his friends. They published his letters, but they took out all of the good stuff. They took out all of the emotions, all of the, and they made it seem as if he was just always a man of reason, a high-minded, lofty philosopher. But there is one letter which is fascinating. It's the only letter where Spinoza loses his cool and he shows his temper. And it comes from a former student of his who had, Spinoza never taught in a university. He always declined teaching in a university. He knew that was the end of the life of the mind. But he, but he did sometimes take private students. And this student had converted to Catholicism. He had gone to Rome. He had been a Calvinist, and he had gone to Rome. He converted to Catholicism. And he writes to Spinoza in very demeaning terms, telling him to convert and talking about the martyrs of Christianity. It's the one time that Spinoza loses his cool, and he says, "You want to talk martyrs? I'll give you martyrs. The Jews have martyrs." Of course, the Spanish-Portuguese Inquisition was still going on when he lived, and his community consisted of refugees from the greatest Jewish calamity until the mid-20th century. And he sort of goes in, and then he starts talking about a martyr who had been killed in Spain with the Shema on his lips. This is the one time when Spinoza betrays an emotion, and it's this kind of Jewish historical emotion. So yes, Baruch is in there.
David, you would say a telling moment there.
Yeah, it's a great moment when he reveals this. I mean, to me, it's really interesting that when he decides to issue forth a blast against the medieval tradition, he doesn't aim it at Aquinas. He aims it at Maimonides.
Yeah.
Yes.
So he is really still in struggle with, dialogue with, whatever term we want to use, with the most important Jewish thinker of the Middle Ages. And of course, he completely rejects Maimonides' idea of God, completely. But he rejects it in a way that, from the point of view of the history of ideas, looks like a dialectical overturning. He turns God into the exact opposite of the Maimonidean God, who is completely abstract, about whom we can say nothing positively at all. So, I think that, of course, it's very hard to get inside the mind of a man who lived in the 17th century and try to exactly figure out what when he wrote the Ethics, what he was exactly thinking of. Was he thinking of Maimonides? Was he thinking of Aquinas or not? Hard to say, but certainly this tendency, this way of reading Spinoza, is something that has been picked up by a long tradition after Spinoza himself. And it's that tradition that has really turned him into a kind of secular Jew.
Well, let's flash forward a few centuries. Spinoza's time in Amsterdam, as I understand it, as you say, the Jewish community were largely refugees from the Iberian Peninsula. And for a couple of generations, the families would wander in and out of Jewish practice into varieties of Christian practice with varieties of degrees of sincerity, and back to Judaism in Amsterdam. In some respects, it seems to me like a time that maybe foreshadowed the life of the Jewish community that exists today, seeing a great deal of living in a kind of pluralism, let's say. If Spinoza is a problematic point in defining what's the Jewish secular as opposed to the guy who left the Jewish community and wouldn't want to be mentioned in the same breath with the other Jews, how do you think, as people who think about Jewish secular thought, what are the contours of this thing? What are the defining boundaries of where it just happens that Jack Benny was Jewish, but Seinfeld was a Jewish sitcom? How do you think in terms of the boundaries of Jewish secular? David, why don't we start with you?
So, yeah, I mean, the way I define it, and it may be a sort of self-serving definition because it allows me to talk only about the people I want to talk about, is a Jewish secularist for me is someone who is engaging with the Jewish tradition or Jewish sources on some level. In that respect, for me, Spinoza is a Jewish secularist. He writes a whole book telling us that we've been reading the Bible the wrong way the whole time, and he's going to offer us a different reading.
Karl Marx.
So Marx, much more problematic. Born Jewish, baptized at age 6, writes the only thing serious he writes about the Jews is a treatise, Zur Judenfrage, on the Jewish question, which arguably is anti-Semitic. He does offer there some interesting observations about how one should think about the Jews, not just, as he says, the Sabbath Jew, but the everyday Jew. In other words, he is already saying, let's look at the secular Jew, the Jew in his secular activities, as something that maybe has been ignored. That's an interesting observation. But basically, Marx has very little to say about Jewish sources, about Jewish history, about the Jews as such. In fact, I think that essay is really more about the Jews as a kind of placeholder within his philosophy rather than about actual Jews. By the way, we do have evidence, though, that Marx frequented Jewish spas in Germany. And because he encountered there the great Jewish historian Heinrich Gretz, and they apparently hit it off. And Gretz sent him a copy of Gretz's translation and commentary in the book of Ecclesiastes. Gretz sends it with a comment that Marx should appreciate this book, seeing as it confirms his secular view of the world.
There's very little God in the book.
So this is actually pretty interesting that we learned something about Marx as a social being, that he actually goes to, when he chooses a spa, he chooses one which other Jews go to. But, generally speaking, Marx is an example, I think, of someone who I sort of exclude from the specific question of Jewish secularism.
Rebecca, where's the borderline for you? Where do you draw it here?
Basically anybody who wants to call themselves Jewish is a Jew, as far as I'm concerned. But it comes up a lot with Jewish writers. For my sins, I judge just about every Jewish writing contest that there is. And there are many. This is actually something to talk about. The great bundles of books that we get from young Jewish writers, who are engaging in the tradition. That it grows and it grows. Leslie Fiedler had predicted maybe 50 years ago that there would be no, this was 50 years ago was the great golden age of Jewish American writing, Bellow and Roth.
Bellow, Roth, Malamud.
And Malamud. And Fiedler, literary critic, had predicted that there would be no more, that this is a kind of urban movement. And as the Jews moved out of urban areas and disseminated, there would be no more Jewish American fiction. Boy, was he wrong. It's extraordinary. But it comes up all the time. What counts as a Jewish writer? Was Kafka a Jewish writer? Kafka never mentions the word Jew once in his published writings. His journal is full of musings and agonizing over his deracinated Jewishness. But there's this one place where he says in the journal, "What have I to do with the Jews? I have barely anything to do with myself, and ought to be content."
That's a tough standard.
That's a great. And ought to be content to just go stand in a corner and breathe. So Kafka. But even that, "What have I to do with the Jews? I have barely anything to do with myself," is so Jewish, right? It's such a Jewish. So, would Kafka qualify in these books that I have to judge as a Jewish writer? One of the rules says, one of the arbitrary rules is you have to mention the word Jew. Well, Kafka, doesn't.
That's one of the contestant.
Sometimes this happens. Do you have to be Jewish in order to write a Jewish book? So this comes up all the time in this context of this incredibly fertile, creative, literary moment that we're in, of young Jewish American writers.
Well, let me put this dilemma of mine to both of you. I'm speaking as somebody who at any given season probably can name all of the Jewish Major League Baseball players in that year and be vaguely aware of how well they're doing. And the more secular we define the Jewish experience, the more we look at it through a secular lens, at some level the more tribal we risk becoming, in that we define membership in ways that don't ask the person how much they want to be associated with this, don't ask what they believe or think or feel about things, but rather we look for DNA. We look for roots. And what about this question of the non-Jewish participant in Jewish secular culture? Is it possible? Does it tally logically? How do you handle it in a course, David?
Well, I mean, it happens all the time. That is, at least 2/3 of my students aren't Jewish. I don't have any idea exactly. I don't do a poll, but these students are participating in not only the study of Jewish culture, but I would even argue, given the position that Jewish studies has in the American Academy, in producing Jewish culture. So I think that these boundary lines that used to be so clear are not so clear anymore at all. I mean, you talk about a non-Jew producing a work of Jewish fiction. I think of John Updike's, a parody of sort of Beck, a book, whatever,
that was Jew envy on Updike's part.
Well, whatever it was pretty good. It was pretty well done. It was pretty. He got the register exactly right. It seemed to me, if I remember correctly. So yeah, I mean, I think it is possible to participate.
There's a fantastic woman at Brandeis in Jewish studies. She is South Korean.
Chai-Ren Fried.
Yes.
Sure.
So she's South Korean. She's not converted yet.
She is not going to convert.
She's not going to convert. Her Yiddish, her Hebrew. And the way this happened was she was sent to boarding school in South Korea. It was a Christian boarding school, and she hated it. She felt very alienated. And in the library, they happened to have a lot of Jewish American fiction. They had Bellow, they had Roth, they had Malamed. She read these, and she felt she was at home. She felt, that somehow, these marginalized people, these were her people. And she's just a superb scholar. She has a book out on the sexual life in the shtetl, much more interesting than you could ever imagine.
She's uncovered more scandals about the Jews than we've uncovered about ourselves.
Maybe we should just talk. It's just amazing. It's not what not what our grandparents told us.
Actually, she's of course a fantastic example of this. But the field of Jewish studies now, thank God, has a lot of non-Jewish scholars who have no interest in converting. They haven't, joined the field with that in mind, producing fantastic scholarship. And this means that we have become like any other field where you don't have to be Chinese to study Chinese history. This is a sign of the integration of the particular field of Jewish studies into the American Academy. And I think it is important to consider Jewish studies as one of the sites in which secular Jewish culture is being developed and produced, even by those who themselves may be religious, because it's in a particular setting which by definition is secular.
I noticed today that online at today's edition of haaretz.com, the date is Saturday, March 12, 2011, and the 6th of Adar, or Adar Beit, I guess, 5771. And to me, that summed up the difference between this issue of secular Jewish life in Israel and secular Jewish life here. There's something in the wallpaper pattern of life in Israel that is Jewish. The language people speak every day is a Jewish language, including many of the Palestinians who work there and live there. And so how does the experience of secular Jewish life in Israel compete with or conflict with the experience of secular Jewish thought here in this country. Why don't you try that one, Rebecca?
I don't, feel that familiar with secular Jewish life in Israel. It does seem, what I'm often told by Israelis is that they don't have to go out of their way in any way to feel Jewish or to know that it's part of their life, the holidays, the time that they're off, the time, even if it's going to the park on Pesach to have barbecues, which is what seems that the majority of Israelis do. But those are their holidays, and Friday you get off early, and Saturday's the day off, and so that it's the background. It's taken for granted. It's part of one's life. Whereas here, if you want to have something Jewish in your life, you have to go out of your way to do it in some way. So I guess we're more self-conscious about it, and perhaps agonize more about it and wonder about what Jewish secularism means in a way that maybe they don't in Israel. But I don't.
Yeah, I actually think it's a little bit different. The Zionist movement was originally a secular movement. There were only a tiny handful of rabbis who supported it, and it was opposed by the rabbinical class almost entirely. And Zionism also was accompanied by a secular movement, secular cultural movement of Hebrew literature. And one of the great successes of Zionism has been creating a living language out of Hebrew and an extraordinarily vibrant culture in Hebrew. That provides a setting for a kind of secular Jewish identity, linked to language, linked to place, that is remarkably strong. At the same time, though, secular Zionism did not fulfill its promise. That is, it ended up with a kind of hybrid state. It's a secular state, but one in which rabbis control certain very important areas of life, marriage and divorce, especially. And so this secular Hebrew culture, which is the dominant culture of the country, is also an embattled culture. It feels that it is if it does not fight this religious opponent and defeat it, that it will be defeated instead. And so the kind of Kulturkampf that existed in Eastern Europe at the end of the 19th century has been replicated in interesting ways in Israel. That Kulturkampf doesn't really exist here. And so, at least not to the same degree. So in other words, the question of Jewish secularism here does not have this oppositional or confrontational character.
But which raises a question, a broader question for me, which is for there to be a robust Jewish secular thought, does there have to be a robust religious scene in which people are being steeped in the traditions of Judaism, so that there's something to argue about, something to leave, something to be secular about?
So I'm wondering just what is the difference between secularism in general and Jewish secularism? I mean, there is a very, very strong secular movement, and it is in this country, and it's extremely oppositional. That the new atheists, that this is, in the last decade, it has been, it's been an extraordinarily vociferous and active movement. A lot of big bestsellers. And when I published Betraying Spinoza, I got swept up into, because of course Spinoza is a hero to freethinkers everywhere, and I got a little bit swept into what I think of now as organized non-religion. It's almost as organized as religion is. The conferences all the time, and even congregations of secular humanists. So, and it's extremely oppositional. The international conferences in this country that are quite hostile to religion, and it's not. I don't know. it's not particularly, a lot of people who are involved in it are Jews, but it's not a particularly Jewish secular movement, but it is oppositional.
No, for sure. I mean, I was referring rather to the Jewish aspect of this, which I think is not, although individual Jews may be involved in this, you're quite right. Of course, we have, there have been ferocious debates around these questions here in this country, but I don't see them as being particularly Jewish debates, frankly. But to your question of whether one has to have a robust sort of religious life, yeah, well, I mean, I think that Jewish secularism gets its energy from its understanding and immersion in the Jewish religious tradition. That is, I don't see a Jewish secularism that would be vital or have any kind of real continuity that is not, in some sense, grappling with the sources of Judaism. Now, actually,
it can't be irrelevant. It can't
be irrelevant. If it's irrelevant, then it's no longer
yeah.
Jewish secularism.
Right.
And then it's secularism per se.
Right,
I
of
think.
course, yes. I mean, to identify as a Jewish secularist is to say that there is something important in the tradition that warrants continuity, or that perhaps warrants continuity, but to agonize about that, you're saying it in the word. I mean, secularism in itself. Well, actually, we should talk a little bit about secularism because it's got so many different meanings. Jewish secularism, I suppose I understand better than secularism because it is both this somewhat paradoxical embrace of the tradition, saying there's something very important in this tradition. There's often, a great emphasis on knowing about the tradition, so there's a valuation of the tradition, but it is secular, and there's something paradoxical in this, but secularism without just plain secularism itself, I mean, it has many different meanings, and to the extent in which Jewish secularism, which of the secular aspects of this multi-secularism it embraces is fuzzy, is something that we could talk about.
Actually, I told this story earlier in the day, so I apologize to those who've already heard it, but so I have a niece who's in Lubavitch, Chabad, and she's read my book, Not in the Heavens, and her comment on it was, I think that every couple of generations, a secular Jew ought to become religious so that his or her children could rebel against it and become secular once again. And I thought that did capture something of this dialectic.
And also what always happens is in a secular family, somebody yes, I mean,
exactly.
it goes back and forth,
yeah.
yes. So...
But while it goes back and forth, and in just a moment we're going to take your questions, and there are microphones, I guess, in the front, and I think we want people to come to the mics in just a moment, but isn't the broader trend, despite those who return to traditions or seek out traditions that were never even part of their own upbringing, the broader trend seems to be more dissipating of that intensity, that the numbers of people who observed dietary laws and who lived within an intact Jewish community, whether they went to the synagogue or not, with the generations in America, has largely given rise to many people whose identity is much more layered, much less intensely Jewish. And at some point, after a couple of generations of secular households, I would think the identity becomes something genealogical, not part of the intellectual framework that you're raised with. And there, I wonder if Jewish secularism is not sort of the resignation letter from the group. That is, it's the moment of departure, and the next generation would simply be secular. Do you disagree?
That is what one would have predicted, just as Leslie Fiedler predicted there would be no more Jewish American novelists. There is something interesting going on here. As a novelist, I find it extremely interesting that the narrative ought to have ended quite some time ago. We are having generations and generations of people far removed from the tradition, and yet there is something, Jewish studies is extremely popular. These books sell like crazy. There's some vitality.
Yeah.
I can't. Well, another thing is, they're. I often joke. I mean, they don't let you out easily. The Jews, they're I often have occasion to quote that line of from, I think it's Godfather 2, where Al Pacino says, "Every time I try to get out, they drag me back in." Right? And I often feel like that as well, But there's something very vital and still going on.
Right. Let's take some questions from the audience.
Spinoza, so important suddenly. What changed?
Well, I don't think it's suddenly at all. I mean, there have been Spinoza crazes off and on. In the 18th century, there was the great pantheism debate, and Spinoza was at the core of that. He was discovered by German Jews in the 1840s as a great sort of romantic figure. The Zionists discovered him. David Ben-Gurion wanted to rescind the harem. Spinoza keeps coming back.
One of the reasons I think that he's so important is because of this new, very active secularism. And Spinoza has a lot to offer secularism. Spinoza tries to show us that you can have a purely secular point of view in which transcendence, spiritual transcendence, is possible. And in fact, the entire ethics leads you to that point. He uses the language, he often uses religious language, and it has to be translated. He calls it intellectual love of God, but it is a transcendent, it is a spiritual, but purely secular point of view. The other reason it's so important now is that Spinoza, although he uses old medieval Aristotelian categories, he had nothing else to work with. His ideas were so extraordinarily prescient. They foretell some of the most important findings of 20th century and 21st century science. Einstein was an ardent Spinozist, as are many string theorists whom I talk to. Every time I go to a physics department and talks about Spinoza, the physicists all say, "I didn't know that I was a Spinozist, but I'm a Spinozist." It's very compatible with the findings of basically, Spinoza's God is what the string theorists call the final theory of everything. This is basically what Spinoza is, and he's a modern trying to bust out of these medieval categories. So this is one of the reasons that people find him so pertinent, and even actually in neuroscience as well. Antonio Damasio has a wonderful book called Searching for Spinoza, and where he shows that the findings coming out of his lab had been foreseen by Spinoza. I mean, the man had amazing intuitions. We're catching up with him now. And so there's been a tremendous interest in him among scientists.
But I would actually add one thing to that, and that is that when I teach him to students, it's something about the sort of uncompromising rigor of his philosophy, the extremism of his positions that students find incredibly compelling, even if they can't accept it. And he really does speak to them on some level.
Okay. We're going to alternate between microphones, so we're going to this side and we'll come back to you. Sir.
Hi, I'm Kerry Shaw. Question raised is, what is the definition of a Jew? My personal take on it, my answer is that a Jew is a person who is concerned with the answer to what is the definition of a Jew.
I think that's very good. Yes, I like it very much.
Unfortunately for,
Now,
so were the Nazis.
serve.
Yeah.
No, not really. They weren't
Well, I
concerned
mean,
with it.
I'm-
No.
you know, it's-
The Nazis passed the Nuremberg law. They weren't concerned with the definition. They just made it up. That's it. They didn't agonize on it. That's it. So I read
Well,
that. So but the surveys indicate that a lot of people who belong to synagogues and even churches don't really believe in the ideology of the dogma, but they join because they want community. They like the idea of going, and here's a group that are there together as people, and it's not dependent on a hobby that they might grow out of. And so the question that many people raise is, why can't there be congregations that have great Jewish community but are non-theistic? And the answer is there are many. And I belong to one. I'm very happy with it. It's the Congregation for Humanistic Judaism in Fairfield County, Connecticut, but there are congregations all over. If you look for the Society for Humanistic Judaism or the Congress for Secular and Jewish Organizations, you'll find probably one in your area. And so it's not oppositional. We celebrate Jewish culture. We care about who we are. We have a Sunday school to teach it to our young. We have bar bat mitzvah and everything. So I was wondering about your comment and take on this.
Yeah, I think this is what you're saying is very true, that and this is one of the arguments I have, I said I'm quite active in the sort of new atheist movement. One of the arguments that I have with my fellow atheist friends is that religion serves many more purposes than contemplating theology, and that you're not going to end religion, if that's what you want to do, by demonstrating the fallacy in the proofs for God's existence. It can easily be done. That's not going to end religion, because religion serves many emotional needs, community, and of course Jews have always, this has been always a very strong aspect of Jewish life, community life. But a community of like-minded people who, basically share your values. You can do good works together, and this is a need that's not going to go away, even if atheism, or aggressive atheism, or the new atheism accomplishes what it wants to do, which is to show, that this is an immature belief system. We ought to outgrow this. People are still going to need congregations where they can not just of like-minded people and of doing good works, but where they can contemplate the great existential issues, life and death, and what does it all mean, and reflect on these things. And that is something that religious communities provide, and that we will always need. This is part of human nature.
Let's go to this microphone now, ma'am. Thank you.
First, I'd like to thank you very much for a rich, thoughtful, and extraordinary conversation. But there is a subject that you have really not addressed. I feel like the child who saw the emperor without the clothes. God. I'd love to hear some discussion about God.
This audience is a tough house to play here. We've dispensed with what's a Jew already, and if either of you would care to.
So I mean the tradition of Jewish secularism, as I understand it, has tried to answer that question in a number of ways. Obviously, there's the atheistic answer. But that to me is not actually the most interesting answer, nor I think is it even the most dominant answer in terms of the kind of tradition of thinkers that I've looked at. First, there are those who follow Spinoza, and they turn towards some kind of a pantheistic understanding of God. That is, God is somehow the same as the universe. But there's also a kind of tradition of what I call secular Kabbalists, who draw from the Kabbalistic tradition certain categories, such as the idea of a kind of divine nothingness, that God is the void, that speaks to a kind of existentialist position in the world. So there are a variety of ways in which God language can still exist, and it's still a concept which one struggles with, even if one rejects a kind of traditional theism.
One thing that I would like to add to that is another subject that we haven't really discussed is ethics, conduct, the rules of morality. And Charles Taylor, in his great book, The Secular Age, says that it used to be that God was sort of the background hypothesis, the assumption, wherever you looked, you saw God in the world. And what made secularism a dominant viewpoint was separating out ethics from theism. And here, I'm afraid I must mention Spinoza, because he is, most importantly for secularism, forget his concept of God and what he really meant by it. The most important thing that Spinoza did, the reason he was damned, first put into herem by the Jews, and then once that happened, castigated by greater Christian Europe well into the Age of Enlightenment. Immanuel Kant had to defend himself against charges that he was a closet Spinozist, was that he tried to ground morality. I wouldn't say he tried to, he grounded morality on purely secular grounds. He divorced it from theism. You can be a good person and not be a member of a religious group and not believe in God. I mean, this is still, in certain parts, certainly in America, a very radical idea. It's why it's political suicide for a politician to say that he's an atheist, because right away it's like, well, he must have no morality. But this is this divorce of theism, belief in God, from ethics is a very important part of secularism. I just like the word atheism very much, because it's a purely negative term. Why would one want to define oneself in terms of what one doesn't believe? I mean, much more I like the word secular humanist, or Jewish humanist, or Jewish secularist, something positive, not atheism.
Ethical culturist would be.
Ethical culturism, right. But this divorce of theology and ethics is, I think, the most important aspect of secularism.
I just thought I would note about the two questions that we've heard so far, note in passing that over the past year or two, the new reform movement prayer book has an entire thread of prayers in it, which are written so as to not require any mention of God. That is, they're written for the person who would come to temple, come to synagogue, without believing in God. The assumption is there are such people. Why should they feel uncomfortable while they're in the service? And there should be prayers for them. Sir.
Yes, my question is whether you can sort of pinpoint a place in history when Judaism sort of transformed from being sort of a theological identity into like a racial identity that was used by the enemies of Jews to sort of carry out their agendas.
So, I mean, I think that one can't pinpoint a specific year, but it's in the second half of the 19th century. And it comes about in part because as Jews begin to acculturate, especially in Germany, France, look more and more like their Christian neighbors, that becomes extremely disturbing to some people. And they fear such Jews who look like them more than the Jews who look differently. And so then one gets out of that a kind of a racial definition of something that cannot be erased just by changing your clothes or how you wear your hair or even your religion. That is, if you convert, you still are a Jew because of this kind of racial core. But the truth is that Jews adopt this kind of thinking as well. And there is a very strong tradition of Jews defining themselves racially, particularly as religion diminishes as a form of identity. There are Jews who accept this idea that giving up one's religion does not mean you've given up your Jewishness. Moses Hess, for example, the sort of forerunner of political Zionism in his book Roman Jerusalem, already has a kind of racial idea, racial definition of the Jews.
But David, can't you go earlier? I mean, say that the hunting down of new Christians who were not sincere in their Catholicism in Spain was the beginning of identifying people of Jewish blood and who were different from the old Christians who had not recently converted.
Yeah, and I mean the statutes of the purity of the blood certainly look like they have a family resemblance to modern racism. I mean, the historical context in which that took place was rather different. It was, commercial competition between these new Christians and older Christians, and but nevertheless, that you're quite right that this is already a kind of a foreshadowing of what happens in the late 19th century.
It was Europe's first experiment with racialist thinking, the Iberian Inquisition, that for generations, for hundreds of years, it went into the 19th century, the category of purity of blood, and there were certain occupations you couldn't be, certain aspects of the army in Spain, certain positions, unless you could establish purity of blood. These are people who had been Christians for hundreds of years. Often, they had entered the priesthood and or become nuns. I discovered when I was doing the research for my Spinoza book that my favorite Catholic saint of all times, Saint Teresa of Avila, was, she was from New Christian on both sides. That this was
so Jews who had converted under
I think the
influence of the
big
Inquisition.
historical question is what influence the Spanish, the particularly Spanish experience had on the development of racism in places like France and Germany. There's still debate among historians on this score. There is probably some influence, but it looks as if this emerges out of a particularly 19th century context.
Welcome. Sir.
I would really like to know your opinions.
Could you pick the mic?
Yes, your opinions on the role of anti-Semitism in past and current secularism.
The role of anti-Semitism in past and current secularism.
And, there were, of course, great Jewish thinkers who thought that it was the anti-Semites that made the Jewish people, that the identity of Jews, divorced from theology or from ritual practice, was made because there were people. To be a Jew was to be somebody who an anti-Semite hated, and that was the definition. To a certain extent, Herzl has this idea. To a certain extent, Hannah Arendt, I think, had this idea that the identity of Jews. I'll tell you, Spinoza had this idea as well. He talks about it in the theological political treatise, that it's the clannishness of the Jews that attracts the hatred, which makes them a people, so that it's this back and forth movement. I think the experience of the United States has shown this not to be true, that this issue of Jewish identity, of Jewish secularism, which I think it has legs. Maybe it's just because I judge all these Jewish fiction contests that I feel that it's a real power in our culture. I think shows that one doesn't need to have anti-Semites around in order to find this battling with the question of Jewish tradition. You don't need the anti-Semite to battle this question and to find it a meaningful existential question.
David, you pass. Yes.
Well, this is sort of a segue from my predecessor and the conversation we had. You talked about they keep drawing me back in. They're not drawing them back in, they're pushing them back in. Because being an ex-Jew is a little bit like being formerly Chinese. okay? It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And also, anti-Semitism is very much alive and well in this country, so that's no longer an issue into making us. And I would not say race. How can we be a race when there are Caucasian, Asian, South Asian, and Black Jews? We're not a race. We are, however, a peoplehood. A peoplehood, which is separate from race and nationality. And that also is something I think distinguishes secular Jews from secular other than Jews, because we are a peoplehood. You can be a Protestant or a Catholic and give up your religion, and then you've given up community with that group. There's nothing else that binds you together. Whereas it is like a membership card in a worldwide organization. I haven't gotten my power play card yet, though. I do not own the media. I do not own the banks. I keep going to the mailbox. It hasn't come yet. But there is a peoplehood that other faiths do not have. And that is why I think when you are a secular Jew, you are still a secular Jew. It's no accident that the head of American Atheists is David Silverman. It's no accident that we are very overrepresented in all of the humanist, secular, and atheist movements. And I've always thought it's because, A, we're taught to question, and hey, this is what you get when you question a lot, and B, we're not scared. We're not afraid. We're not going to go to heaven. We're going to go to hell. And this is, I think, a whole part of the whole secular movement.
Honey, your remarks stand. Sir.
It seems to me that the secular Judaism is a healthy and a vital addition to Judaism. Have you seen parallel developments, say, i.e., secular Islam or secular Christianity?
I don't know if you could hear the question, but our questioner was saying that he regards secular Judaism as a positive contribution to Judaism. Do you see parallel movements, secular Islam or secular Christianity?
Well, I certainly know some people who call themselves secular Muslims, so I have to take them at their word. I mean, I think what the last questioner raised is an important point here, and that is that whereas Islam and Christianity are purely religions and don't have any kind of national or peoplehood associations, what we're dealing with here is some kind of a hybrid.
Yeah.
I mean, I actually think that the Jews are not unique in this. That is, for example, the Greeks have a national church. So to be Greek is to usually belong to that national church, even if you're lapsed from the church. That would be a kind of analogy to what we're talking about. But I think that certainly one encounters many people whose secularism is grounded to some degree or the other in a conversation with their own religious tradition.
I should just add here, by the way, as someone who's going off on a reporting trip to Turkey and Tunisia at the end of the month, back to Turkey, one of the principles of the Turkish revolution, of the Kemalist Ataturk revolution, was in Turkish laik, which is from the French laïcisme, laïcisme, and that is their secularism, and it meant, in those terms, take off the turban, women take off the scarf, don't do the call to prayer in public from the mosque, eat during Ramadan, and Bourguiba, the independence leader of Tunisia, actually was also a secularist, and if you noted the resignations during the recent revolution or coup or whatever it was, as the ambassadors were retiring, they would resign in protest, long live the secular republic. So in that part of the world, secularism definitely has a connotation. At this point in history, it's generally regarded as having been an extremely heavy-handed one. And the movement is in a swing back toward religiosity, as has certainly been seen in Turkey, where a party with its roots, not its program, but its roots are in Islam or in people with a religious background, and where when I was first there 20 years ago, teachers would tell young women, take that scarf off, get that off off your head, and the teachers were then getting afraid that there would be recriminations against them. Today, I'm assured that's tolerated. Certainly in a public university, that's now tolerated. So there has been, we translate the term into secularism, but it has been a very potent, modernizing, westernizing concept, certainly in Turkey and also in some other societies.
It seems to me that what we've seen, in the last couple of months with these revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt in particular, is that we always assumed that either there was a secularism imposed by the army, as in the case of Turkey, or it was going to be Islamist. And now there appears to be a third possibility, and that is some kind of a secular, or it's secular, but it also includes Islamist democratic movements. We have no idea if they're going to succeed, but there is this new voice that I think is very interesting.
But a Turkish scholar whom I was talking to at work this past week in Washington in preparation, when I was asking him about when we say the Turkish army is a bastion of secularism, what does that mean? Does it mean that if you go to the mosque, you don't advance beyond lieutenant? And he said, well, probably not. It's probably okay to go to the mosque, but if your wife is covered, that'll probably stunt your career in the Turkish army. People are very conscious of outward displays of faith, and in the army at least, that's not the way to get ahead. So.
But I think in that part of the world, what we often mean when we say secularism is something. It's political secularism. It's what in the West we've taken for granted for a very long time. It's not particularly about metaphysics, and it's not particularly about ethics. It's not even particularly about ritual. It's about separation of mosque and state, or church and state. It's what Mark Lilla had called the Great Separation, which took place in the West in the 17th century after all of the bloodletting between the religious wars. And so when in that part of the world, when we're talking about secularism, we're talking about something that took place in the West a long time ago.
A long time ago. I think we're on this side. Sir.
Yes, hi. The lady that was here before actually raised the point that I wanted to raise, and that was Jewish secularism. To me, the thing that separates it from everything else is this ability to question the Word of God. If you can question the Word of God, you can question yourself, and you can question authority, whether it's secular or religious. And that is not a tradition that seems to be part of Christianity or Islam. And it's this kind of questioning which leads to what's typically known as Jewish neurosis, because you question yourself constantly. And it also leads to democratic values, because you take the anti-position automatically. Well, if that group is excluded, that's not just because they're excluded with no reason is not a good enough reason to exclude them. And you can see how it develops because of this this questioning that's part of the Jewish tradition.
Is that an example, David Biale, that you would take back to Scripture and the people who argue with God?
I think that's right. I mean, I think the fact that the rabbinic tradition always preserves minority opinions does make a pretty major statement. At the time when the church was burning its heretics, at least the heretics within the rabbinic community were somehow preserved. Heretics, or shall we say those who oppose, even heretics, that is the greatest heretic, Elisha ben Abuya, the stories about him are very interesting because they actually bring his teaching back in through the back door. So there is a way in which this is a tradition that is open to contention, to not suppressing the minority point of view. Now, what we don't know, and this is, I think it's probably impossible to know, whether this particular mentality or cast of mind really feeds into the predominance of Jews in secular and revolutionary movements. And sometimes that argument has been made, and I'm not willing to say that argument is false, but I think it's probably somewhat unprovable. The fact that Jews are willing to take these kind of contrarian positions in the modern period also has something to do with our social location as a minority.
Right, marginalization.
What?
Marginalization.
Marginalization, absolutely.
Yeah.
So there's some way in which these aspects of the Jewish tradition, which I take quite seriously as setting a certain tone, play a role, but so does our particular history in the last several hundred years.
Yeah, I was just going to say that's really a feature of Jewish intellectualism, and that's not Jews at large. It's a certain type of Jew, somebody who is a little alienated from his own people to a degree, but is still maintaining this Jewish tradition of questioning. And
Okay, fair. On this side.
Two quick points before I ask my question. One, you mentioned ethical culture, and while many Jews attend ethical culture, it doesn't deal with Jewish history and Jewish tradition. The other point I wanted to make is Ms. Goldstein didn't like the word atheism. Sherwin Wine, the founder of humanistic Judaism in this country, coined the word agnostic. He said, we're just not even going to discuss it. I hope I'm quoting him correctly.
You're saying
agnostic.
Agnostic with an I.
We're just going to ignore the subject. But now my question. I have always considered myself a humanistic Jew, a secular Jew, and a cultural Jew. In addition, there's another brand, which was the workman's circle kind of Jew. I was told today by an authority figure here that they're not all the same. And I am really curious about how you see the differences.
Well, it sounds like, the Trotskyites who would debate among themselves about
the Shachtmanites versus the non-Shachtmanites.
Yeah, who exactly is Orthodox here? I think that these are categories that each person can define in their own way, and I would not presume to try to impose on them my own definition.
Here.
Hi. I really love the idea of secular Judaism, and I'm glad that there's some optimism about it here. But I myself am a little concerned, and I look back to the Association for Jewish Studies conference that I attended in December when lots of people were predicting the oncoming demographic nightmare, which is that eventually we're going to run out of secular Jews, and the growing Jewish population are actually the Orthodox Jews, and the ultra-Orthodox especially, who don't vote like the other Jews, who don't think like the other Jews, and who put these kinds of projects in jeopardy. So I'm wondering what you guys think about that.
Before passing to them, I will say you remind me of a story I was once on at a West Bank settlement, Beit El, where a settler showed me a big chart he'd made of his family tree. He was, I think, a fifth-generation Jerusalemite, and the patriarchs in long caftans all had 12 children, and their children had 10 children, and there was this one wing with a Hamburg on it back in 18 whatever, who had 2 children, then down to 1 children, and disappeared. And his moral of the story was, that's why, as he saw it, we very religious will be here when you folks have disappeared.
I mean, the demographic argument is a very strong one and very alarming, and not just in Judaism, but in fact in all the Abrahamic religions, that in fact the more fundamentalists, the more they're zealots, actually, the more they reproduce. Women are generally not liberated, and they stay at home, and they have one child after the other. And this is true in Christianity. It's certainly true among the Mormons. It's true certainly in the Jews and Muslims as well. I think in Israel, I don't know what the forecast is, but
it's a good. Well, there also, I think, there are still policies of subsidy as well for
there is,
families.
but I mean, I think it's said that actually already now, slightly over 50% of first-grade students in Israel are either Arab or ultra-Orthodox, Haredi, or ultra-Orthodox or Orthodox.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the same demographic holds there.
Yeah. And there's been actually a lot written in Europe about the Muslim population in Europe, which is also, that there's been some hand-wringing because the same demographics are going on there, that it has to do with the inequality between the genders and what work the women are put to in the more fundamentalist sex, which is to reproduce. And so there is this concern.
On the other hand, if the concern is for the population of secular Jews in the future, secular Jews very often spring from religious families down the way. And this is where 200 years ago, there weren't that many secular Jews, and they came from someplace.
If they go to the same, if they,
They're better at producing books than they are at producing
produce
children.
more books than children.
I mean,
Well, that's true.
The other aspect is if they go to schools, if the fundamentalists are just going to schools, fundamental schools, and aren't even exposed, as the Haredi community in Israel or in this country is, they're not even exposed to the outside world, the retention rate is quite high. And so it's different from what we've experienced in this country before this.
But it's not 100%.
Yeah.
And there is, falling away from these communities. And the truth is that, the modern world is, the secular forces in the modern world are very powerful. So I wouldn't necessarily assume that those demographic trends are going to, end up the way the demographers say. Demographers can only go on what they see now. There are some demographic arguments, for example, that the high rate of intermarriage among American Jews actually produces a positive result from the point of view of Jewish demography, in that a certain percentage of these people actually raise their children as Jews, even though maybe a higher percentage do not. So it's a little bit more complicated, perhaps, than what you suggested. I tend to think that these kind of predictions are very, very hard to make. Just a few months ago, who would have predicted a revolution in Egypt? Things can change on a dime.
I thank the Posen Foundation and the New School for putting on really an excellent event. I'm enjoying it a lot. I come as a non-Jew and but someone who's steeped in Jewish culture, as the husband of an Israeli Hebrew speaker, frequent visitor to Israel. And I find that I don't think Spinoza is the role model for secular Jews. He was an amazing man, and he was, to me, a role model for seculars, but not Jewish seculars. And for some of the reasons you said, it was the intensity of his God talk was like looking up at the sun and burning out your retina. Mm-hmm. It just scorched everything around it. Anything particular about Judaism was gone from his vision. It was like the mezuzah, the ark of the everything was just not there anymore. For some people, that's exactly what they wanted, that intensity, the fervor. But most people can't stand that. Not everyone is a string theory physicist who lives in a life of the mind of perfect rationality. I think the vision of secular Judaism, and again, I'm an outsider, so you could tell me if I'm wrong about this, is much more the kind of communities that actually do exist, where they wear the talit and they pray, the prayers that the generations before them grew up with. They may not be believers in the sense that their rational minds have told them God exists, but they do feel that they are Jews. And the more they have the tactile sense and living within that community, their forebears and so on, the more they do feel like Jews, part of a tradition that can last.
Yeah,
Thank
well,
you.
Yeah.
I think we can endorse exactly what you've said.
Exactly.
I mean, it certainly is the case that Spinoza is very rarefied, and clearly people find meaning in communities and in rituals without necessarily having to read a book.
Yeah.
I think we should take questions from the people who are standing right now, and that would be would wrap it up. Sir.
David, I'm very taken, as always, with your stuff, and I like the idea of dialogue with the past and the dialectic. I think it's very important. We should not ignore this. It's not secular Judaism is not in a vacuum. But I'm wondering whether the text of Torah or Talmud is compelling any longer to a secular Jew today, or whether, in fact, the literature that you're judging is the new text, which we really need to read, whether it's in short story form or in literature. There's a book called The American Talmud, which sort of talks about this concept. I believe that is our new literature. The literature that we write together ourselves, our own memories and stories, becomes the material we need to grapple with. I wonder whether you would agree with that.
Rebecca, you were nodding.
I agree with you. Yes, I do. I mean, I think that one of the surprising things is that the narrative continues, that it continues in very surprising ways. It's surprising that the narrative continues, and the narratives themselves are surprising. I think, however, some knowledge of the tradition is important. What happens with a lot of the fiction, for example, a lot of it is Holocaust-centered. A lot of it is defining Judaism as victimhood. I mean, a terrible definition of Judaism. And so, and in fact, a fellow Jewish writer of mine says that, I've had many arguments with him, says that that is the defining event of the Jewish people, was the destruction in Europe, and that seems to me an ignorant statement. That seems to me to be a statement that's foisted on us from outside. Again, that the anti-Semites are the ones who create this peoplehood. That's not the case. So I think for Jewish fiction or Jewish nonfiction, but for this category of letters that has this surprising vitality, to continue in this way, it has to be informed and not just be centered on, for example, the Holocaust. The previous generation, the great golden age of Jewish literature, centered on assimilation. That was the theme, certainly, of Philip Roth and Melamed to a great extent, and Bellow to some extent. That issue is over. We're as assimilated as we want to be, and one can disappear into the great melting pot or not, so that the subject matter of this letter, of these Jewish letters, which I think is carrying, I'm with you, I think it's extremely important in being sort of the new Torah, the new Talmud. But I think it has to be informed. I think that's what Felix Posen's foundation is all about.
But isn't each generation entitled to its own period of what to wrestle with? There was the immigration novels, clearly, that wrestled with that transition, and maybe this is finally the period for the Holocaust novel for a generation or so until we discover the novel of Suburbia or whatever else is going to come of it.
Yeah, Peter, I mean, I think it's not either or. I think that, yes, every generation has its own writing to do. And it may be that this is the writing that we need to do about the Holocaust, or at least that's part of what we need to write about. But I mean, I like the metaphor of a Jewish library. And, you don't throw out the books that the previous generation wrote from a library. They're still on the shelves, and hopefully they'll still circulate. And that, I mean, as a teacher, I regard it as my obligation to introduce my students to the books written in previous generations and to excite them with what's in there. I think there's an enormous amount in Talmud that's incredibly relevant and exciting to a secular Jew, or for that matter, to a secular non-Jew today. That does not preclude reading the kind of literature that you're referring to, that Rebecca's been talking about.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Sir.
I really think that perhaps, as regards to what you said and what I had been thinking, that secularists come from a background where once there were no secularists. And I really believe that perhaps the internet and or globalization are going to trump fundamentalist religion. And I am, for example, looking forward to this week to going to an orientation meeting of volunteers in an organization called Footsteps, which assists young Jewish people who have opted out of the ultra-Orthodox life, and I look to see who supports them. It's the who is who of Jewish organizations, which really surprised me. I want to say one word about atheism. I'm very happy to be an atheist, which means I don't have to be bothered with God. I'm not bothered about. It's not part of I don't think about competition sports or popular music, and I do not think about God. What does bother me is the wedding of humanism and doing good with Judaism, and especially secular Judaism. It's like, we're not religious, but we're still very nice. And I just can't. No, this is really serious. I'm not saying, I can't wrap my mind around this. I think I'm a humanist with a small h, as long as it doesn't really hurt my self-interest. But I can't really get my mind around this. It's very much there, and it infects me a little bit. And maybe you could enlighten me about this wedding of Jewishness, especially secular, and on the one hand, and humanism and doing good on the other.
Well, I guess there are two different ways of answering your question. One is sort of the philosophical question, the grounding of ethics on a purely secular grounds, that there is an intellectual argument to be made for this. It's not obvious to many people. It seems to many people that one needs a God in order to, one, know what the difference between right and wrong is, and two, for it to be enforced. That without the great policeman up in heaven enforcing this, what reason would there be to, even if there were ethical rules, to obey them? So you hear these arguments, and I think it's very, very important philosophically to counter them. They're fallacious arguments, and so there's work to be done there. As far as the more practical thing, sort of gathering together in order to do like-minded people and perhaps to do good works, well, some people need that and some people don't. For me, I grew up in a very religious background, and going by the statistics of my family, things don't look very good. Actually, I'm the only one who left out of a very, very large family. One of the great, for me, one of the great perks was I didn't have to be part of an enforced community anymore. I didn't have to gather with people in this forced way. I could choose as I wanted. But I know that many people feel differently, and they want a set community of like-minded people. And I think this is a very personal decision. One of the horrible things that philosophers and psychologists fall into is, and I have to say Spinoza does as well, is thinking that there's more homogeneity in human nature than there really is. We have great differences in what we need from our communities, great differences spiritually in where we find satisfaction, and so, what's good for somebody is not going to be good for you. I'm not joining any communities. I'm glad to be
I hear in the question the notion of this word with two meanings, that performing mitzvahs, is both doing good deeds for people and doing commandments. What you're telling me is the commandment idea is dropped, but the idea of you have to go do good deeds is still there and survives even into the completely secular tradition. We have one more.
I'm the last. Robert, you had mentioned the fact that in the new Reform Siddor, the Mishkan Tefillah, that there's whole sections of prayers in which there's no mention of God.
Yep.
That's nothing new. That was taken from the old. What you didn't mention is that there's an entire section there in the new Siddor, which is Hebrew with transliteration.
Yes, with transliteration.
I wanted people to understand that in this new Siddor, the Reform have taken steps more towards the center, towards conservative, and the arguments within the Reform have been very, very hot and heavy. The second thing is that when I was growing up in Philadelphia, many, many years ago, I'm a product of the Volksschule. And at the time in Philadelphia when I was growing up and a member of the Volksschule, and I went to school there from, I guess, about the age of
You should
10.
explain what the Volksschule is.
The workman's circle, the opposite thing. I presume most
It's
people...
a Yiddishist,
Yiddishist.
labor view of the world.
But it was a secular, Jewish secular program. There was a large number of those schools in the city of Philadelphia, including a high school. The same thing in New York. The reason I bring this up is that neither one of these cities have much left. There's a remnant of this. But this was a way at that time of educating your children prior to going to college. What I've heard today is mostly education directly at adults. What's being done to educate the children of these families from the age of, let's say, 10 up, so that by the time they get to college, they've got a grounding of what it means to be a secular Jew?
This is a major problem. It's a major problem.
That's why I bring it up.
And
I'm the last.
I'm glad that you were standing when I said that.
We on the stage do not have the solution, but clearly this is going to require funding. It's going to require a commitment to a different vision of education than has existed until now, as opposed to the religious day school. One has to think towards a different model of Jewish school. But I think you're absolutely right that again, I teach these students when they arrive at university, and by then it's sort of too late. One does what one can, but the kind of grounding that you are speaking of from your own childhood is something that is very hard to come by today.
I have a desperate request for a point of information from this side of the room, so I will give you that one privilege.
I'm the education director at the Jewish Children's Volksschule in Philadelphia. So I just would like to let you know that we are alive and very well. We have
How many schools do you have?
We have a Sunday school and an adult community. We have
How many
115 children.
How many schools do you have?
One.
But
we do have one.
I said that the remnant, because when I was in Philly, if I remember correctly, there were 6 or 7 plus a high school. So what I'm saying to you and to everybody else in this audience, if it's only a remnant and you have only 115, when at one time there was probably 400 or 500,
right.
How are we going to how are the people in this audience going to have their children or their grandchildren educated?
Well, I guess I would remark to some of the comments that were made about
I'm being an
the
argumentative
future.
is because I have a very strong feeling about that.
I understand. I would I could also say that the whole intermarriage situation, we are often the place where families go. We're often the last stop after people are no longer comfortable in the synagogue world for folks to come with us. So there is a future that we're hoping to be able to capture. We're in the red, we're breaking even, we're very happy, and please come visit us. We're having the 100th anniversary of secular Jewish education as well.
Let me just...
November 6th at the new Jewish Museum.
I'm glad that you found each other after all these years. Before handing over the microphone, I'd first like to thank David Biale and Rebecca Newberger Goldstein for being just scintillating company up here and incredibly smart about these questions that I'm quite interested in. I'd also like to thank the gentleman who's about to speak and who's responsible for all this, Felix Posner. Hiya.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful evening. The reason I wanted to say something is to do about schools. Of course, it is crucial to teach Jewish secularism starting with children. It is far too late to start at universities. And in fact, our foundation has succeeded to start in Israel, where we have a program at Tel Aviv University training students to become teachers in the Mamlachti school system, to teach Judaism as culture. And we are teaching it in approximately 30 schools now in Israel. For instance, we have one community.
Did you say Rishon LeZion? Was that what?
Pardon?
Did you say in Rishon LeZion? You told me earlier that
all the schools in Rishon LeZion are teaching our course in grades 7 to 12. And that is approved by the Ministry of Education. So it's a combination of the Posner Foundation, Ministry of Education, and the municipality.
And what are the central texts of the course? What are the most important things that the student is acquainted with?
Well, the very same thing as we do in university, but scaled down towards with language which is acceptable for high school students rather than university students. But university students is really far too late. We're doing it at universities because that's where we got started. It it must be done in schools if it's to be taken off. And there's no such thing at all in the diaspora, except in Mexico and in Buenos Aires. There's old schools in that field. But absolutely nothing in the United States, nothing in Europe, and it's a shanda.
Well, thank you very much for the shanda. Again, Felix, thank you for your contribution and for making this happen. Guys, thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for your questions. Take care.